The countdown clock on the wall read 40 seconds, and my hands were already shaking. I am Vex Thala Orn, and on the day everything changed, I was standing in a line of 53 cadets outside the sealed doors of Chamber 9, waiting to be thrown into a storm that had ended more careers than any weapon in the fleet's arsenal. My skin, which is naturally a pale blue crystal lattice, was already dimming at the edges from stress. When a Krillian gets nervous, we lose color. By the look of the cadet beside me, a lanky thrall with segmented arms, half the line was losing color too. Only one cadet was not shaking. She stood 3 places to my left, humming a tune under her breath like she was waiting for a transport shuttle instead of a Class 9 blizzard drill. The single most feared exercise in the entire Survival Academy. Her name was Mara Voss, and she was the only human any of us had ever seen in person. 30 seconds, said the automated voice overhead. The thrall cadet next to me, whose name was Corin, made a small clicking sound with his mandibles, which is what his species does instead of swallowing hard. You have done this before, he said to Mara, not quite a question. Nope, Mara said, first time. Then why are you not afraid? Mara shrugged, a very human gesture I had only seen in training videos before that day. I don't know yet if there's something to be afraid of. Seems like a waste of energy to panic in advance. I wanted to tell her that everyone on this platform had watched the casualty records from last year's drill. I wanted to tell her that a Vexel cadet named Ilira had lost consciousness at -60 degrees and had to be pulled out with frostbite creeping up both of her tendrils. I wanted to tell her that Chamber 9 did not care how calm you felt walking in, because the storm did not know the difference between confidence and foolishness. But the doors were already sliding open. 10 seconds, the voice said, and then the countdown became a blur of numbers I stopped hearing, because the smell hit me first. Cold has a smell, if you have never experienced it. It smells like nothing at all, like the universe scrubbed clean of every comfortable thing you have ever known. It rolled out of the open chamber in a gray fog, and beyond it I could see nothing but white. The doors finished opening. The countdown reached 0, and 53 cadets walked forward into a wall of screaming wind. I want to describe what it felt like in that first moment, because I think it is important for you to understand exactly what the rest of us were facing, before I tell you what Mara Voss did instead. The temperature simulators in Chamber 9 are calibrated to match the worst recorded blizzard conditions found anywhere in charted space. A frozen moon called Kethranal Prime, where the wind alone has been measured strong enough to lift a small transport vehicle off the ground. The moment I stepped through the doors, the wind found every gap in my thermal suit and turned it into a knife. My crystal skin, which regulates its own internal warmth, through slow, careful processes that took my ancestors millions of years to develop, began contracting so fast, I heard it crack in 3 places along my left arm. Not break, crack, a sound like a glass dropped on stone, except the glass was me. Around me, the other cadets were already struggling. Corin the thrall had frozen mid-stride, his segmented limbs locking up the way cold-blooded creatures do when their body temperature drops too fast for their nervous system to keep pace. A pair of Zalthu twins, whose species evolved on a world with a permanent tropical climate, were screaming into their comm units, begging for extraction less than 90 seconds into the exercise. I could see their panic lights blinking red through the whiteout, tiny dots of desperate color in an ocean of gray and white. I forced myself forward, 1 foot after the other, following the emergency beacon markers that were supposed to guide us to the simulated shelter zone, half a kilometer away. Every step felt like wading through wet cement that had been chilled to the temperature of deep space. My lungs burned with each breath, the air so cold it felt like inhaling shards of glass. I told myself this was a simulation, that nobody would actually die today, that the safety systems would pull us out the moment our vital signs crossed a dangerous threshold. I told myself this, and I still could not stop the fear from clawing up my throat. That was when I saw her. Mara Voss was not struggling forward like the rest of us. She was not screaming into her comm unit or clawing at the emergency beacon in a panic. She was walking, calm and unhurried, off to the side of the marked path, scanning the terrain with the focused expression of someone solving a simple puzzle rather than fighting for her life. While the rest of us fought the wind head-on and lost ground with every gust, she moved at angles to it, using the larger drifts of packed snow as windbreaks, letting the storm slide past her instead of crashing into her. "This way is easier," she called out to no one in particular, her voice somehow carrying over the wind without any visible effort. A few cadets close enough to hear her turned to look, confusion plain even through the frost building on their visors. I did not follow her example, not then. I was too afraid, too locked into the belief that the marked path was the only safe path, that deviation meant failure, that failure meant the end of everything I had worked for since I left my home colony 3 years earlier to earn a place in this academy. So I kept walking straight into the wind, and the wind kept winning. Within the first 5 minutes, 6 cadets were extracted. I watched the emergency lifts open beneath their feet and pull them down into the recovery bay below the chamber floor, their bodies limp with hypothermia before they had even reached the halfway point of the drill. The Zalthu twins were among them, their tropical physiology giving up almost immediately once their internal temperature dropped past a threshold their bodies had never been designed to survive. I did not blame them. Nobody in that chamber blamed anyone for failing. We all understood, on some level, that this drill was designed to break most of us. The instructors called it a Class 9 exercise for a reason. Class 9 conditions exist on only a handful of worlds across the entire mapped galaxy, and every single one of those worlds is officially classified as uninhabitable by every civilized species we know of. Every species except, apparently, humans. I did not know that yet, not fully, not in the way I would come to understand it by the end of that long and terrible day. All I knew in that moment was that my crystal skin was cracking faster than it should, that my extremities had gone numb past my elbows, and that somewhere ahead of me, through the blinding white curtain of the storm, a human girl was walking through the worst conditions any of us had ever faced, like she was taking a stroll through a garden. 10 minutes remaining until checkpoint 1. The automated voice announced through our comm units, barely audible over the howling wind. Current failure count, 11. 11 cadets down, and we had not even reached the first checkpoint. I pushed myself harder, driving my legs forward through snow that had begun to pile past my knees, each step a battle against a wind that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. Beside me, a young ferret cadet named Osla stumbled and fell, her insectoid limbs no longer responding to her commands. I reached down without thinking and pulled her back to her feet, and for just a moment, I forgot about my own cold, focused entirely on getting her moving again.
"Thank you," she managed, through chattering mandibles.
"Just keep moving," I told her, though I was not entirely sure I believed my own advice would be enough. We struggled forward together for another stretch, and it was during this stretch that I lost sight of Mara Voss entirely. The storm had thickened, visibility dropping to almost nothing, and the wind had shifted from a howl to something closer to a roar, a physical force that pushed against my chest, like a hand trying to hold me back. I stumbled once, twice, caught myself both times, and kept moving, because stopping meant the cold would win faster. "Checkpoint 1, the voice announced. "Current failure count, 19. 19. More than a third of our starting group, gone before the halfway mark." I thought of the training records I had studied before the drill, statistics I had memorized, in the hope that knowledge would somehow prepare me for what was coming. The average failure rate for Class 9 drills across all previous academy classes stood at just above 40%. We were on pace to shatter that record before we had even reached the true center of the storm. Osla fell again beside me, and this time she did not get back up. Her breathing had gone shallow, her chitin plates dulled with frost, and I knew without needing a medical scanner that her body had reached its limit. I activated her emergency beacon myself, watching as the recovery lift opened beneath her and carried her gently down and away from the storm. 20 cadets gone. I stood alone in the howling white, my own strength fading fast, wondering how much longer I could keep pushing forward before the cold claimed me too. And it was in that moment, shivering and half blind from the storm, that I heard something I did not expect to hear. "In the middle of the worst conditions any of us had ever faced." I heard someone laughing. Not a cruel laugh, not the laugh of someone who had lost their mind to the cold, but a genuine, warm sound of amusement, carried strangely clear across the roaring wind. I turned toward the sound, squinting through the frost gathering on my visor, and there she was again. Mara Voss. kneeling in the snow perhaps 30 meters away, packing handfuls of snow into a shape that looked almost like a wall, humming that same tune from before, completely unbothered by conditions that had already ended the drill for a fifth of our starting class. "Vex," she called out, using the short version of my name that only a handful of cadets had bothered to learn. "Come over here. This spot's better." I do not know what made me listen to her in that moment. Perhaps it was simple desperation, the understanding that continuing forward on my current path was going to end with me being pulled out of the chamber unconscious. Perhaps it was curiosity, a small flicker of wonder about how a creature from a species none of us understood could seem so entirely at peace in the middle of a storm that was breaking the rest of us apart piece by piece. Whatever the reason, I changed direction, fighting the wind at an angle the way I had seen her do earlier, and made my way toward the strange, calm shape kneeling in the snow ahead of me. By the time I reached her, my legs had gone almost entirely numb, and I collapsed more than I walked the final few steps. Mara caught my arm without any visible strain, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked so unremarkable beneath her thermal suit, and helped me settle down behind the low wall of packed snow she had been building. "Better, right?" she said, gesturing at the wall. "Blocks most of the wind. You just have to know which way it's coming from, and stop fighting it head on." "How?" I managed, through chattering words. "Are you not freezing?" She considered the question for a moment, tilting her head in a way that reminded me of the training videos I had watched of humans thinking through a problem. "I mean, I am cold," she admitted. "It's definitely cold, but cold's not really the same as dangerous, if you know how to handle it. Where I grew up, this would just be a normal winter storm. A bad one, sure, but not exactly rare." I stared at her, my crystal skin still cracking faintly at the edges, despite the shelter from the wind. "A normal winter storm," I repeated. 20 minutes remaining," the automated voice announced overhead. "Current failure count, 26. 26. Half of our starting group had already failed, and we were not yet at the 20-minute mark. I thought of Corin, the Threll cadet who had frozen mid-stride at the very beginning of the drill, and wondered if he had made it to a recovery lift, or if he was still out there somewhere in the white, fighting a losing battle against a storm his species had never been built to survive. Mara reached into a pouch on her thermal suit and pulled out a small, compact device I did not recognize, something with a spark mechanism built into a metal casing. "You know what would make this a lot better," she said, almost to herself, as she began arranging a small pile of collected debris in front of the snow wall. "A fire. And marshmallows. This place really needs marshmallows." I had no idea what a marshmallow was. I did not ask. In that moment, huddled behind a wall of snow with my body slowly losing its battle against the cold, all I could think about was how strange it was that the calmest person in the entire chamber was also the only one thinking about snacks. The fire, when Mara finally coaxed it to life using the little spark device from her pouch, should not have been possible. Chamber 9 was designed to simulate a genuine Class 9 environment, down to the smallest detail, and part of that simulation involved suppressing any open flame the moment it reached a certain size, a safety measure meant to keep desperate cadets from attempting exactly what she was doing. And yet the flame held, small and stubborn, cupped inside a ring of packed snow she had built with the same careful patience she had shown building the wind wall. "How is that still burning?" I asked, watching the tiny orange light flicker against the endless white around us. "Wind's blocked, and I kept the tinder dry under my suit," she said, feeding a few more scraps of collected debris into the flame. "The chamber probably has a suppression system for anything that gets big enough to be a real fire hazard, but this is barely bigger than a candle. Not worth the system's attention, probably." I did not fully understand her explanation, but I understood the result. A small circle of warmth existed in the middle of the worst storm any of us had ever faced, and for the first time since the drill began, my crystal skin stopped cracking. I held my hands as close to the flame as I dared, feeling something like relief spread through my chest. 15 minutes remaining, the automated voice announced. "Current failure count, 31. 31 out of 53. I did the calculation in my head and felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the storm. We were on track to lose nearly every cadet in the drill, and I had a growing suspicion that the instructors monitoring us from the control room above the chamber were watching those numbers with the same disbelief I felt. Why do you think everyone keeps failing? I asked Mara, mostly to keep my mind occupied, mostly because talking felt better than sitting in silence and listening to the wind try to tear our small shelter apart. She thought about the question seriously, the way she seemed to think about everything, without the rushed anxiety I felt pressing against every thought in my own head. Different worlds make different bodies, she said eventually. Your people came from somewhere mild, right? Steady temperatures, not much variation. The Krill home colony has a very stable climate, I confirmed. We do not experience extreme seasonal shifts. Right. So your body never had to learn how to handle something like this. It's not a flaw. It's just not what you were built for. She poked at the small fire with a stick she had found buried in the snow. Earth's different. We've got deserts hot enough to cook an egg on a rock, and we've got places cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under a minute. Sometimes both exist a few hundred kilometers apart. Bodies that survive that kind of range end up handling extremes a little better than bodies that never had to. I turned this idea over in my mind, trying to imagine a world with such violent contrasts built into its very geography. Every world I had ever heard of, every world safe enough for civilized species to call home, maintained some degree of consistency, some baseline of survivable conditions across most of its surface. The worlds classified as Deathworlds, the ones marked in warning red on every navigational chart in known space, were the exceptions specifically because they lacked that consistency. Is Earth truly classified as a Deathworld? I asked, remembering fragments of rumors I had heard whispered among other cadets in the weeks leading up to this drill. Mara laughed again, that same warm, easy sound from before. Officially, yeah. I saw the classification when I applied for the Academy transfer program. Made my mom laugh for a solid 5 minutes when I told her. She grew up somewhere with regular ice storms and yearly floods, so a formal warning label seemed a little funny to her. 10 minutes remaining, the automated voice cut in. Current failure count, 38. 38. I felt the number settle over me like another layer of frost. Only 15 cadets remained active in the chamber, and based on the sounds I could hear carried faintly on the wind, distant shouts, and the occasional activation chime of an emergency beacon, that number was continuing to shrink with every passing minute. You should try to rest here as long as you can, Mara said, noticing the way I had begun shivering again, despite the small fire's warmth. The wall blocks most of the wind, and the fire's doing what it can. You don't need to push back out into the open until the timer's almost done. Will you stay too? I asked. She glanced toward the swirling white beyond our small shelter, and for just a moment, I saw something shift in her expression, something that looked almost like restlessness rather than fear. I think I want to see how far the storm actually goes, she admitted. Feels kind of small, staying in one spot the whole time. I stared at her in disbelief. You want to go further into the storm? On purpose? I mean, we're graded on completing the checkpoint route, right? Might as well actually see the checkpoints instead of just waiting out the clock next to a fire. She stood up, brushing snow from her thermal suit with an ease that still did not seem real to me. You should stay here, though. No shame in that. You already lasted way longer than most of the others just by finding decent shelter. Before I could argue, she had already stepped back out beyond the edge of our snow wall, disappearing almost instantly into the white curtain of the storm. I sat alone by the small fire, torn between the instinct to stay somewhere safe and a strange, unfamiliar pull to follow her, to see for myself what she saw when she looked at a Class 9 blizzard and felt nothing close to the fear the rest of us carried. In the end, curiosity won. I forced myself back to my feet, my legs protesting every movement, and followed the faint trail of disturbed snow she had left behind her. The wind hit me again the moment I left the shelter of the wall, but I had learned something from watching her, some small trick of angling my body against the gusts instead of walking straight into them, and I found I could make slightly better progress than before. I caught up to her near a ridge of packed ice that marked, according to the faint glow of a beacon marker half buried in the snow, the location of Checkpoint 2. She was crouched beside the marker, brushing frost away from its surface to read the display, and she looked up when she heard me approaching. You changed your mind, she said, sounding pleased rather than surprised. I did not want to sit alone, I admitted, which was true, though it was not the entire truth. Something about her presence made the storm feel less like an enemy and more like a puzzle worth solving, the way she seemed to treat it. 5 minutes remaining, the automated voice announced, and this time there was something different in its tone, a strain that had not been present before. Current failure count, 44. 44. Only 9 of us remained in the chamber, and based on the numbers I had heard the instructors mention during our earlier briefing, this drill was on pace to become the single worst failure rate in the history of the Academy's Class 9 program. We should head back toward the extraction zone, I said, glancing at the timer counting down on my wrist display. The drill ends in 5 minutes, and if we are not within range of the recovery lifts when it does, we could be stranded out here until the manual extraction team arrives. Mara nodded, though I noticed she did not move quite as urgently as I would have expected given the warning. Yeah, we should probably start heading back, she agreed, standing up from beside the checkpoint marker. Feels a little bit like leaving the job half finished, though. We're barely at checkpoint 2. There are still 3 more checkpoints on the route, I said. I do not think anyone was expected to complete the entire course today. Maybe not, she said, and there was something in the way she said it, a note of quiet consideration, that I would not fully understand until much later, when I learned more about what humans considered a genuine challenge and what they considered simply a walk through difficult weather. We began making our way back toward the extraction zone together, retracing a rough version of the path we had taken, though the storm had already begun erasing our earlier footprints and reshaping the snowdrifts around us. The wind seemed to grow stronger as the timer counted down, a final surge of intensity that I would later learn was an intentional part of the simulation, a last test designed to separate the cadets who had truly adapted from those who had simply been lucky enough to survive this far. 3 minutes remaining, the automated voice said. Current failure count, 49. 49. I stopped walking for a moment, staring out at the white chaos around us, trying to process the number. 49 out of 53 cadets had failed this drill, an outcome so far beyond the historical average that I found it difficult to fully comprehend. Only 4 of us remained active in the chamber, and one of those 4 was walking beside me, with an expression that suggested she was mildly disappointed the storm was not more challenging than it had turned out to be. "Vex," Mara said suddenly, her voice sharpening slightly for the first time since the drill had begun. "Get down." I did not question her. I dropped immediately, pressing myself flat against the snow, and a heartbeat later, a violent gust of wind tore across the space where I had been standing, strong enough that I heard it whistle through the frozen air, like something almost alive. Mara had dropped as well, but she was already moving again a moment later, crawling low across the snow toward a small outcropping of ice that offered partial shelter from the worst of the gust. "The wind spikes get stronger the closer you get to the final minutes," she said, once we had both reached the relative safety of the ice outcropping. I read about that in the briefing packet. Guess they really do want this to be the hardest part. "You read the briefing packet?" I asked, slightly surprised, given how casually she seemed to have approached everything else about the drill. "Of course I did," she said, as though the question itself was strange. "Just because something doesn't scare me, doesn't mean I don't want to know what I'm walking into. Knowing what to expect is half the reason I wasn't panicking back at the start." 2 minutes remaining, the automated voice announced. Current failure count, 51. 51. My breath caught in my throat, the number settling over me with a weight that felt almost physical. Only 2 cadets remained active in the entire chamber. I did not need to guess who the second one was. We pushed forward through the final wind spikes together, Mara leading the way with the same calm focus she had shown from the very first moment the doors opened, and me following as best I could, my crystal skin cracked in a dozen places but somehow, against every expectation I had carried into that chamber, still standing. The extraction zone beacon came into view through the swirling white, just as the timer ticked down toward its final minute, a warm yellow glow that felt, in that moment, like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. 1 minute remaining, the automated voice said. Current failure count, 52. 52. I stopped walking entirely, staring at the beacon in the distance, and then slowly turned to look at Mara Voss, who was still moving forward at the same unhurried pace she had maintained through the entire drill, apparently unaware, or simply unconcerned, that she and I were now the only 2 cadets remaining in a storm, designed specifically to break creatures like us apart. 52 out of 53. I had not fully understood, until that exact moment, standing in the swirling white with the extraction beacon glowing faintly ahead of us. Just how far this drill had gone, beyond anything the Academy had ever recorded before. I thought of Corin, the Threll cadet who had frozen up at the very start, and Osla, who had fallen twice before her body finally gave out, and dozens of others whose names I had barely learned before watching them vanish into the recovery lifts. Every single one of them, gone. Every species represented in our class, gone. Every cadet except a Krillian whose skin had cracked in more places than I wanted to count, and a human who was currently studying the extraction beacon, with the mild curiosity of someone deciding whether or not to bother finishing a meal. 30 seconds remaining, the automated voice said, and the strain in its tone had grown even more pronounced. An artifact, I later learned, of the recording system logging failure statistics, in real time, and adjusting its own vocal inflection based on how far outside normal parameters the results were falling. "We should move," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. "The extraction zone is close. If we reach it before the timer ends, we complete the drill without needing a manual pickup." Mara nodded, and finally, she picked up her pace, moving toward the beacon, with long, steady strides that ate up the distance far faster than my own exhausted steps could manage. I pushed myself to keep up, every muscle in my body screaming with a cold that had settled so deep I was not sure it would ever fully leave me, and together we crossed the final stretch of open, wind-battered snow toward the warm yellow glow of safety. 15 seconds, the automated voice announced. The wind chose that exact moment to intensify one final time, a last defiant surge that felt almost personal, as though the simulation itself had decided it was not finished testing us. I stumbled, my numb legs finally failing to respond quickly enough, and I felt myself falling toward the snow with a slow, sickening inevitability. I did not hit the ground. Mara caught my arm before I fell, her grip firm and sure despite the chaos around us, and hauled me back onto my feet with a strength that seemed entirely disproportionate to her size. "Almost there," she said, her voice steady, almost cheerful, as though we were finishing an enjoyable hike rather than the closing seconds of the most brutal drill in Academy history. "Just a little further. 10 seconds." We crossed the final few meters together, her hand still gripping my arm, steadying me through the last of the wind spikes, and stepped across the extraction zone threshold with a margin of time so narrow I did not fully register we had made it until the automated voice spoke again, this time with a note that almost sounded like relief. "Extraction zone reached. Drill complete. Final failure count, 52 out of 53. The wind died almost instantly, the storm simulation cutting off with an abruptness that left my ears ringing in the sudden silence. Around us, the chamber's lighting shifted from the harsh white of the blizzard to a softer, warmer glow, and the snow beneath our feet began to shimmer and fade as the holographic projectors powering the simulation deactivated one section at a time. Within moments, we were standing not in a frozen wasteland, but in a large, empty room with a metal floor and walls lined with recovery equipment. The storm nothing more than a memory and a lingering, bone-deep chill. I sank to my knees the moment the adrenaline that had carried me through the final stretch began to fade, my legs finally giving out now that there was no more storm to fight against. Mara knelt down beside me, checking the readout on a small device attached to my thermal suit sleeve. "You're going to be fine," she said, her tone gentle but confident. "Your core temperature dropped further than it should have, but you're already starting to recover now that the environmental systems have shut off. The medical team will probably want to check you over properly, but I don't think you need anything urgent." I stared at her, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "You caught me," I said, somewhat uselessly, given that the fact was obvious to both of us. "In the last moments of the drill, you could have reached the extraction zone faster without stopping to help me." She looked genuinely confused by the observation, as though the idea of leaving me behind had never once crossed her mind as an option. "Why would I do that?" Before I could find an answer, the far wall of the chamber slid open, and a group of Academy staff hurried in, led by a tall officer with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested he had been watching our final moments on a monitor somewhere with his heart in his throat. This was Commander Owen Blake, the head instructor responsible for overseeing all Class 9 survival exercises. A man whose reputation for stern discipline was matched only by his reputation for having personally designed some of the harshest drills in the Academy's curriculum. "Cadet Orn," he said, kneeling beside me with a medical scanner, already active in his hand. "Report your condition." "I am cold," I said honestly, "but I believe I am stable." He nodded, running the scanner over my cracked crystal skin, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this exact check hundreds of times before. Behind him, a second officer, a sharp-eyed woman, with close-cropped auburn hair, whose name tag read, Lieutenant Grace Ellery, was staring at Mara, with an expression I could not quite read, somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "Cadet Voss," Commander Blake said, turning his attention to Mara once he was satisfied I was stable. "You reached the extraction zone with 8 seconds remaining on the clock, after diverting from the marked path to check checkpoint 2, and after stopping to assist a fellow cadet during a critical wind event. Your vital signs throughout the drill remained within what our systems classify as comfortable operating range for the entire duration." "Comfortable might be a stretch," Mara said, rubbing at her arms where the cold had clearly still affected her, even if not to the degree it had affected the rest of us. "But it wasn't too bad, all things considered." Commander Blake stared at her for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to find the right words, a man clearly unused to being at a loss in front of his cadets. 52 cadets failed this drill today," he finally said. "That is not a record we have seen before. That is not a record we expected to see for many years to come, if ever." "I read that the average failure rate is usually around 40%, Mara said, nodding along as though this were simply an interesting piece of trivia, rather than a statistic that had just been shattered before his eyes. "Guess this class really struggled with the cold." Lieutenant Ellery made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, quickly covering it with a cough when Commander Blake glanced her way. "Cadet Voss," the commander said slowly, "do you understand the significance of what just happened here today?" "I mean, I think so," Mara said. "It was a really tough exercise, and most of the class didn't make it through. That's rough, but that's kind of the point of a drill like this, right? To find out where everyone's limits are before it actually matters." "And you did not reach your limit," Commander Blake said, his tone somewhere between a statement and a question. Mara considered this seriously, glancing back over her shoulder toward the now empty and quiet chamber, where, just minutes earlier, a storm powerful enough to break 52 cadets had been raging. "Honestly, it didn't really feel like I got close to it," she admitted. "It was cold, and the wind was strong, but I've camped in worse conditions back home. This felt more like a rough weekend trip than an actual emergency." I watched Commander Blake's expression shift through several stages of disbelief, before finally settling into something like careful, controlled neutrality, the expression of a man who had spent his entire career believing he understood the outer limits of what his cadets could survive, only to have those limits redefined in front of him by a single, unassuming human girl who had spent the entire exercise treating a deadly simulation like a pleasant outdoor activity. "We will need to run a full debrief," he said finally, straightening up and gesturing for the medical team waiting near the chamber entrance. "Cadet Orn, please go with the medical staff to have your condition properly assessed. Cadet Voss, I would like you to remain here for a few additional questions." I allowed myself to be helped up by 2 medical staff members, my legs still unsteady beneath me, and as they guided me toward the exit, I glanced back one final time. Mara Voss stood in the center of the now empty chamber, surrounded by staff who were looking at her with expressions ranging from awe to something that looked almost like fear, and she stood there entirely unbothered by any of it, as calm and unremarkable as she had been the very first moment I saw her standing in line outside those chamber doors. It was only much later, sitting in the medical bay with a thermal blanket wrapped around my shoulders and warm fluid slowly restoring feeling to my numb extremities, that I began to truly understand what had happened that day. 52 cadets, representing a dozen different species from across known space, each one carefully selected for this academy, based on exceptional physical and mental resilience, had been broken by a single simulated storm, and one human girl, barely out of her homeworld's equivalent of secondary education, had walked through that same storm as though it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, standing between her and the end of an otherwise ordinary day. I did not yet know the full scope of what this meant, not just for our academy class, but for the wider galactic community that had spent centuries classifying worlds and species according to careful, consistent standards of danger and survivability. I did not yet know that the events of that single afternoon in Chamber 9 would eventually ripple outward across the entire fleet, reaching officers and researchers and diplomats who had never even heard the name Mara Voss before that day. All I knew, lying in that medical bay with my cracked skin slowly beginning to heal, was that something fundamental about my understanding of the galaxy had shifted, and I was not entirely sure yet whether that shift was something to celebrate or something to fear. The medical bay was louder than it had any right to be, considering that most of the 52 cadets recovering inside it were too exhausted or too embarrassed to speak. I lay on a reclined treatment bed near the center of the room, a warming pad pressed against the cracks in my crystal skin, listening to the quiet murmur of voices around me, and trying to piece together the full scale of what had just happened. 2 beds away, Corin the Threll sat wrapped in a heated blanket, his segmented limbs finally responding normally again after nearly an hour of careful thermal treatment. He caught my eye and gave a small, exhausted nod, the closest thing to a smile his species' facial structure allowed. Further down the row, Osla the Ferric cadet was already sitting up, sipping something warm from a cup, her chitin plates restored to their normal dark sheen. "How did you make it to the end?" Corin asked me, his voice still a little rough from the cold. "I saw you drop early in the storm. I thought you were finished." "I found shelter," I said, which was true, though it left out the most important detail. Mara Voss built a wind wall and a small fire. I stayed there until near the end of the drill. Corin's antennae twitched, a gesture of surprise among his people. "The human-made fire? In Chamber 9? I thought the suppression systems prevented open flame." "It was very small," I said. "I do not think it registered as a genuine hazard." Osla set down her cup and turned to look at me properly. "I heard the final numbers before I lost consciousness near checkpoint 1, she said. 52 failures. Is that accurate?" "It is," I confirmed. Mara and I were the only 2 cadets to reach the extraction zone before the timer ended. A ripple of quiet conversation spread through the recovery beds as this information passed from cadet to cadet, and I watched expressions shift from exhaustion to disbelief to something that looked almost like unease. It was one thing to fail a difficult drill alongside the majority of your classmates. It was another thing entirely to learn that a single cadet, a species none of us had ever trained alongside before, had walked through the exact same storm that broke the rest of us without ever coming close to her own limits.
"What is she?"
Corin asked quietly, and I understood the question was not really about Mara Voss specifically, but about her entire species, about a homeworld that produced individuals capable of shrugging off conditions that had defeated cadets selected from a dozen different worlds, specifically for their physical resilience. I did not have an answer for him. I was not sure anyone in that room did. It was Lieutenant Grace Ellery who finally provided some context, arriving in the medical bay perhaps 20 minutes later, with a data pad in hand, and an expression that suggested she had spent the intervening time reviewing information she found deeply unsettling. She moved through the recovering cadets, checking readouts and offering quiet reassurances, until she reached my bed and paused. "Cadet Orn," she said, "how are you feeling?" "Better," I said honestly. "The warming treatment has helped considerably." She nodded, glancing down at her datapad before looking back up at me, with an expression that seemed to be weighing how much information was appropriate to share. "I imagine you have questions," she said. "Most of your class does. Is it true that Earth is classified as a death world?" I asked, deciding there was little value in easing into the question gradually. Lieutenant Ellery's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise at my directness, but she answered without hesitation. "It is. Officially, under the Galactic Habitability Index, Earth carries a death world classification. It has for as long as it has been catalogued by the Fleet's Survey Division."
Then how does anyone survive there long enough to build a civilization?
Corin asked from his bed nearby, apparently listening closely enough to join the conversation. "That," Lieutenant Ellery said, "is a question a great many people across the fleet have been asking themselves since Cadet Voss submitted her academy application 3 years ago." She glanced around the room, taking in the collection of exhausted, recovering cadets. and seemed to decide that a fuller explanation was warranted, given the circumstances. The Deathworld classification system was designed centuries ago to categorize planets according to how survivable their natural conditions are for an average settled species without significant technological support. Extreme temperature ranges, dangerous wildlife populations, unstable weather patterns, elevated background radiation. A world earns points toward the classification based on how many of these hazards exist simultaneously across its surface. And Earth qualifies for all of them? I asked. Earth qualifies for enough of them, Lieutenant Ellery said. Significant temperature variation between regions and seasons. A recorded history of large predator populations that coexisted with the dominant species for the majority of their development. Weather patterns, capable of producing storms with wind speeds that would concern even our most hardened survey teams. And humans built their entire civilization directly through all of it, without the benefit of any advanced technology for the vast majority of their history. The room had gone very quiet, every recovering cadet listening intently now, the earlier murmur of scattered conversation replaced by a collective, uneasy silence. I do not understand, Osla said slowly. If their world is genuinely that dangerous, how did they not simply fail to develop as a species at all? Most Deathworld classifications describe environments too hostile for sustained habitation by any sapient life. That is precisely the question that made Cadet Voss's Academy application such a point of interest when it first arrived, Lieutenant Ellery said. Humans did not merely survive their homeworld's conditions, they thrived within them, spreading across nearly every habitable region of their planet, long before they developed any technology beyond simple tools. Their species did not adapt to a single environment. It adapted to survive across dozens of drastically different environments simultaneously, from frozen polar regions to arid deserts to dense tropical forests, often within the same generation of settlers. I thought back to what Mara had told me during our brief shelter behind the snow wall, about a world where deserts hot enough to cook food on exposed stone existed only a few hundred kilometers from places cold enough to freeze skin within a minute. I had assumed, at the time, that she was exaggerating for effect, the way cadets sometimes did when describing their homeworlds to impress new acquaintances. I was beginning to understand that she had not been exaggerating at all. What does this mean for the rest of us? Corin asked, and I could hear the genuine concern in his voice, a question that went beyond simple curiosity into something closer to professional anxiety. If human cadets are simply capable of surviving conditions that break the rest of us, does that change the standards this academy holds us to? Lieutenant Ellery hesitated before answering, and in that hesitation, I saw something that unsettled me more than anything else she had said so far. That, she said carefully, is a question the senior staff are currently discussing. I do not have an answer for you yet. What I can tell you is that today's results have generated significant interest beyond this academy. Reports of the failure rate have already been forwarded up the fleet's Education Oversight Command. Because of the record? I asked. Because of the record, Lieutenant Ellery confirmed, and because of Cadet Voss's performance specifically. It is somewhat unusual for a single individual to complete a Class 9 drill, with vital signs remaining within comfortable operating parameters for the entire duration. It has, as far as our records show, never happened before. A quiet unease settled over the medical bay following this admission, a feeling I recognized in the expressions of my fellow cadets even through the lingering fog of exhaustion and cold. It was not fear exactly, not in the way we might have feared a hostile creature or an armed threat. It was something more unsettling than that, a recognition that something fundamental about our understanding of galactic survivability had just been quietly, thoroughly upended by a single unassuming girl who, at that very moment, was sitting somewhere else in the Academy compound, answering questions from a stunned Commander Blake. I did not see Mara again until several hours later, once the medical staff had finished their assessments and cleared the majority of recovering cadets to return to our quarters for rest. I found her in the mess hall, sitting alone at a corner table, with a tray of food in front of her, looking entirely unbothered by the events of the day, as though completing the most brutal survival drill in Academy history, while barely straining herself, was simply an ordinary Tuesday. "How are you feeling?" she asked when I sat down across from her, setting down my own tray with hands that still trembled slightly from the after effects of the cold. "Tired," I admitted, "and confused." Confused about what? About you, I said honestly. About your homeworld. Lieutenant Ellery explained some of the classification details, but I still do not understand how your species survived long enough to build a civilization on a world with those kinds of conditions. Mara considered the question while chewing a bite of food, and I noticed, not for the first time, that she seemed to take every question I asked with the same patient seriousness, never treating my confusion as foolish or my questions as tiresome. Honestly, she said eventually, I think it's mostly because we didn't have a choice. Nobody handed humans an easy planet and told us to make it work. We got the one we got, and either we figured out how to survive it, or we didn't survive at all. Enough of us figured it out that here we are. But the conditions, I pressed, the temperature extremes, the predators, how does a species even begin adapting to something so dangerous? Slowly, I guess, she said, with a small shrug that somehow managed to make an entire history of struggle and adaptation sound almost casual. A little bit at a time, over a really, really long stretch of years. And honestly, a lot of people didn't make it. That's part of the history too. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed. But the ones who survived kept getting better at it, generation after generation, until eventually, surviving the hard stuff just became normal. I sat with that answer for a long moment, turning it over in my mind, trying to imagine an entire species built through countless generations of exactly the kind of struggle that had just broken 52 of my fellow cadets in a single afternoon. You do not seem worried, I said finally, about what today means, about how the rest of the academy is reacting. Mara glanced up from her tray, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. I mean, I get why everyone's making a big deal out of it, she said. But from where I'm sitting, I just did a survival drill, and it went pretty okay for me. I'm not trying to prove anything, or scare anyone. It's just what I know how to do. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that explanation as simply and completely as she seemed to offer it. But even as she spoke, I could not shake the feeling that something larger was already beginning to move, somewhere far beyond the walls of our academy, set into motion by a single storm and a single girl who genuinely, sincerely, did not understand why anyone found her so remarkable. The formal debrief was scheduled for the following morning, and every surviving cadet from our drill group was required to attend, gathered together in a large briefing hall that normally served for lectures rather than disciplinary reviews. I sat near the front, beside Corin and Osla, my crystal skin fully healed overnight thanks to the medical staff's treatment, though I still felt a lingering exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed fully able to shake. Commander Blake stood at the front of the hall, flanked by Lieutenant Ellery and a third officer I did not recognize, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a formal bearing that suggested she held rank well above either of them. Mara sat 2 rows behind me, looking entirely relaxed, chatting quietly with a Vexel cadet who had apparently decided that surviving the drill together, even indirectly, was grounds for a friendly conversation. "Attention!" Commander Blake said, and the murmur of quiet conversation across the hall fell silent almost immediately. Yesterday's Class 9 Blizzard drill produced results that require formal review. I want to begin by saying, clearly and without ambiguity, that a 52 cadet failure rate reflects no shame on any individual in this room. The conditions simulated in Chamber 9 were calibrated at the absolute upper limit of survivable extremes, and the vast majority of sapient species across known space would be expected to struggle significantly against those conditions. He paused, glancing briefly toward Mara before continuing. What occurred yesterday was, in the Academy's recorded history, unprecedented. Not because 52 cadets failed. Historical data suggests that outcome, while severe, falls within a statistically plausible range for a drill of this difficulty. What is unprecedented is that one cadet completed the exercise without her vital signs ever crossing into a stressed or dangerous range. A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the hall, cadets glancing toward Mara with expressions ranging from curiosity to something that looked almost like wariness. She, for her part, seemed entirely unaffected by the attention, sitting with the same relaxed posture she had maintained throughout the entire briefing. "This raises a number of important questions," the silver-haired officer said, stepping forward and introducing herself as Director Elena Pratt, head of the Academy's Curriculum Oversight Division. Questions this institution has never before needed to seriously consider. Our entire survival curriculum, from the earliest introductory courses through the most advanced Class 9 exercises, has been built and calibrated based on the physiological limits of species we have trained for generations. We understand, with reasonable precision, what a Krillian body can endure, what a Threll nervous system can withstand, what a ferric exoskeleton can survive. We have centuries of data supporting those standards. She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle over the room before continuing. We have almost no data on human physiological limits. Cadet Voss is the first human to ever enroll in this academy's survival program, and her performance yesterday suggests that our existing framework for calibrating drill difficulty may be entirely inadequate for training alongside her species. Are you saying the drill was too easy for her? A cadet near the back called out, a question that drew a few nervous laughs from around the hall. I am saying, Director Pratt replied evenly, that a Class 9 drill, designed to represent the absolute upper bound of survivable natural conditions found anywhere in charted space, did not appear to challenge Cadet Voss in any meaningful way. I am saying that we do not currently possess a classification level within our curriculum sufficient to properly train or evaluate a human cadet, because our highest classification level was built assuming it would represent a genuine, serious threat to any sapient life form attempting to survive it. The hall fell into a heavy, uncertain silence. I glanced back toward Mara, curious how she would respond to hearing her own species discussed in such stark, almost alarming terms, and found her sitting with a small, faintly embarrassed expression, as though she found the entire conversation somewhat awkward rather than validating. If I may, Director Pratt continued, I would like to hear directly from Cadet Voss regarding her experience during yesterday's exercise. Cadet Voss, would you be willing to share your perspective? Mara stood, a little reluctantly, and I could see her weighing her words carefully, clearly aware that whatever she said next would carry weight far beyond a simple personal account. I mean, honestly, it wasn't that different from stuff I did back home, she said. My family used to go camping pretty often, and where we usually went, winter conditions could get pretty rough. Nothing quite as extreme as the chamber simulation, but similar enough that I already knew some of the basic tricks. Finding windbreaks, building a small shelter, managing body heat instead of just trying to power through the cold. You mentioned building a fire during the exercise, Lieutenant Ellery said. Our suppression systems are designed to prevent open flame within the chamber. How did you manage that? It was really small, Mara said, sounding almost apologetic. I don't think it ever got big enough to trigger whatever threshold the suppression system uses. I wasn't trying to break any rules. I just figured a little bit of warmth would help, and it seemed worth trying. It helped considerably, I said, before I had fully decided to speak, drawing several curious glances in my direction. I sheltered with Cadet Voss for a portion of the drill. The fire and wind wall she constructed allowed my body temperature to stabilize enough that I was able to continue and eventually complete the exercise. Director Pratt made a note on her datapad, her expression thoughtful. Cadet Orn, would you say that Cadet Voss's assistance was the primary factor in your successful completion of the drill? I considered the question honestly before answering. I believe it was a significant factor, I said. Without her shelter, I do not believe I would have recovered sufficiently to continue past the halfway point. A quiet murmur passed through the hall again, and I noticed several cadets glancing toward Mara, with expressions that had shifted from wariness toward something closer to genuine gratitude, an understanding beginning to settle over the room that whatever unsettling implications her performance carried for the Academy's future curriculum, her presence in that storm had also directly helped at least one of her fellow cadets survive it. Thank you both, Director Pratt said. This information will be extremely valuable as we begin reviewing our curriculum standards. Cadet Voss, before we move to the formal portion of the debrief, is there anything else you would like to add regarding your experience yesterday? Mara hesitated, glancing around the hall as though weighing whether her next words were appropriate given the seriousness of the discussion. There is actually one thing, she said finally. Please, go ahead. I wanted to file a complaint, Mara said, about the survival supply kits provided for the drill. The hall went very, very quiet. Commander Blake's expression shifted into something carefully controlled, the look of a man bracing himself for criticism regarding safety equipment, or medical support systems. Something serious and procedural.
What is the nature of your complaint, Cadet Voss?
Director Pratt asked, her tone carefully neutral. There weren't any marshmallows, Mara said. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I genuinely was not certain, for a moment, whether the entire hall had simply stopped breathing at once. Commander Blake blinked, clearly processing the statement, while Lieutenant Ellery pressed a hand briefly over her mouth, in a gesture that did very little to disguise the fact that she was struggling not to laugh outright. Marshmallows, Director Pratt repeated slowly. They're a food item, Mara explained, apparently entirely sincere despite the reaction rippling through the room around her. Small, soft, usually sweet, really good for roasting over a campfire. I had a fire going for most of the drill, and honestly, it just felt like a bit of a missed opportunity not to have any on hand. I understand the survival kits are designed around emergency nutrition rather than recreational snacks, but I think it's worth considering for future drills, especially if fire building ends up becoming part of the standard curriculum going forward. I stared at her, and I could see the same disbelief mirrored on nearly every face around the hall. Cadets who had spent the previous day fighting for their lives, in the most brutal simulation the Academy had ever produced, now watching the one cadet who had walked through that same storm, essentially unaffected, raise a formal complaint about camping snacks. Director Pratt cleared her throat, visibly composing herself before responding. I will make certain your feedback regarding the supply kits is noted, Cadet Voss, she said, her voice admirably steady, given the circumstances, though I suspect this may be the first such request in the Academy's history. Thank you, Mara said, sitting back down with the satisfied air of someone who had simply raised a reasonable and practical concern, entirely unaware, or perhaps simply unbothered, by the fact that her complaint had just landed in the middle of what was, up until that exact moment, one of the most tense and serious debriefings the Academy had ever conducted. I looked around the hall at my fellow cadets, at the strange mixture of exhaustion, awe, and quiet disbelief written across every face, and I understood, with a clarity that settled deep into my crystal bones, that nothing about how we understood our galaxy, our own limits, or the species sharing it with us, would ever look quite the same again. The story of the marshmallow complaint spread across the Academy faster than any official report ever could have managed on its own. Within 2 days, it had reached every training deck and mess hall on the station, retold and reshaped a dozen different ways, by cadets who found something both hilarious and quietly unsettling about the entire situation. By the end of the week, it had traveled beyond the Academy entirely, passed along through personal messages and casual conversations between officers stationed across the fleet, until it reached ears far removed from our small corner of the galaxy. I learned of its wider reach almost by accident, nearly a month after the drill, when I received a message from a distant cousin serving aboard a Krillian survey vessel stationed several sectors away. She had heard, she wrote, an amusing rumor about a human cadet who treated a Class 9 blizzard drill like a minor inconvenience and then complained about snacks. Was I aware of any truth to the story? I was, of course, more aware of the truth than almost anyone else she could have asked, and my reply, intended simply to satisfy her curiosity, apparently found its way into a wider circulation among her own crewmates, who found the account just as remarkable as everyone at the Academy had. It was around this same time that the Academy began receiving formal inquiries from outside institutions, requests for information regarding the drill results, and, more specifically, regarding human physiological baselines that no existing fleet database seemed to possess in any meaningful detail. Director Pratt, I later learned, spent the better part of a month fielding calls from research divisions, military strategists, and academic institutions across multiple sectors, all of them suddenly, urgently interested in a species that had, until very recently, occupied only a small and largely overlooked entry in the fleet's expanding catalog of member worlds. I did not fully understand the scale of this interest until Lieutenant Ellery called a small group of us, myself, Corin, and Osla among them, into a private briefing room, roughly 6 weeks after the drill, to discuss what she described as developments worth sharing with cadets who had directly experienced the events firsthand. The research division has compiled a preliminary report on human physiological data, she began, sliding a datapad across the table toward us. Some of it draws from historical records humans themselves have shared willingly as part of their integration into the fleet. Some of it comes from more recent observational studies, including data gathered during Cadet Voss's drill performance. I picked up the datapad, scanning through the summary Lieutenant Ellery had prepared, and felt a familiar chill settle over me, though this time it had nothing to do with cold. Their species evolved across environments most Deathworld classified planets would consider extreme individually, Lieutenant Ellery continued, watching our reactions carefully. But Earth's surface contains a remarkable range of those extremes, existing simultaneously across different regions. Frozen polar zones, arid deserts capable of lethal daytime temperatures, dense tropical regions, with some of the highest concentrations of dangerous wildlife recorded on any charted world, volcanic activity, seismic instability, and unlike most Deathworlds, which tend to remain hostile to sapient life indefinitely, humans did not merely survive isolated pockets of Earth's surface. They spread across nearly all of it. "How is that possible?" Corin asked, echoing the same question that had been circulating through the Academy since the day of the drill. No other known species has managed comparable expansion across such varied hostile terrain without advanced technological support. The research division's working theory involves what they are calling adaptive generalism, Lieutenant Ellery said. Rather than specializing to survive one specific type of environment exceptionally well, the way most species have evolved, humans appear to have developed a broader, more flexible baseline resilience, allowing individual members of their species to adapt relatively quickly to a wide range of different hostile conditions within a single lifetime, rather than requiring generations of specialized evolutionary pressure. Asla shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "That sounds," she said slowly, "as though there are very few environments across the known galaxy that a human could not eventually learn to survive."
Lieutenant Ellery did not immediately answer, and her silence told me more than any explanation could have.
"There is something else," she said finally, "something the research division flagged as particularly noteworthy, and something I think is important for you to understand, given your direct experience with Cadet Voss. Human historical records describe a cultural practice, widespread across nearly every region of their homeworld, in which individuals voluntarily seek out difficult or hostile natural conditions for the purpose of recreation." "Recreation," I repeated, certain I had misunderstood. "Recreation," Lieutenant Ellery confirmed. "Deliberately climbing dangerous mountains, deliberately swimming in waters known to host lethal predators, deliberately spending extended periods in extreme cold, extreme heat, or extreme isolation, entirely by choice, entirely for personal enjoyment or challenge, with no practical necessity driving the decision." Cadet Voss's own mention of family camping trips, which several of you noted during the debrief, appears to represent an extremely common and unremarkable version of this broader cultural pattern. The room fell quiet as the three of us absorbed this information, and I found myself thinking back to the small fire Mara had built behind our snow wall, to the calm, almost pleased expression on her face as she walked through conditions that had broken 52 of her classmates, and to her genuine, apparently sincere disappointment that the exercise had not offered a proper opportunity for marshmallows. "This is being treated as significant intelligence," Lieutenant Ellery said. "Not because anyone believes humans pose any kind of hostile threat. Quite the opposite, in fact. Cadet Voss's conduct throughout the drill demonstrated consistent cooperative instincts. Assisting fellow cadets, even when doing so, offered her no personal benefit. The concern, if it can even be called that, is more philosophical in nature. Every other species currently within the fleet has built its understanding of danger, of environmental limits, of what constitutes a survivable world, around a shared framework of vulnerability. Humans appear to exist largely outside that framework, and nobody is entirely certain yet what that means for how the fleet should think about long-term expansion, colonization efforts, or even basic strategic planning in hostile or unclaimed territories. "Are other academies experiencing similar situations?" Corin asked. "Surely Cadet Voss is not the only human currently serving within the fleet's training programs." "She is not," Lieutenant Ellery confirmed. "And reports from several other institutions describe comparable patterns, though none quite as dramatic as what occurred here. A human cadet at the Varan Naval Academy reportedly completed a wilderness survival evaluation nearly 2 full days ahead of the expected timeline, citing boredom as her primary reason for requesting early extraction. Another, serving aboard a deep space research vessel, reportedly volunteered for an external repair mission during a minor radiation event that had the rest of the crew sealed inside protective shelter, on the basis that the exposure levels, while elevated, remained within what she considered a manageable personal risk tolerance. I sat with this information for a long moment, trying to reconcile the picture forming in my mind. An entire species scattered now across the fleet, each individual carrying within them the same quiet, almost baffling resilience that Mara Voss had displayed so plainly during our drill, each one treating conditions the rest of us considered genuinely life-threatening, as little more than minor inconveniences worth mentioning only in passing. "What does the fleet intend to do with this information?" Osla asked quietly. "That," Lieutenant Ellery said, "is precisely the question every research division, strategic command office, and academic institution, across known space, is currently trying to answer, and I do not believe any of them have settled on a satisfying response yet." She gathered the datapads back from us, her expression thoughtful and, I thought, faintly uneasy. An officer who had spent her entire career operating within a well-understood galactic framework of danger and survivability, now facing the quiet, growing realization that a species barely beginning its journey into the wider fleet had already, without any intention of doing so, upended nearly every assumption that framework had ever rested upon. "For now," she said finally, "the Academy has been asked to update its curriculum standards to better reflect what we now understand about human physiological baselines, and to consider what adjustments might be necessary for training mixed classes going forward. Whatever changes come from that process, I suspect all of you will be among the first cadets to experience them firsthand." 3 months after the drill, I stood once again outside the doors of Chamber 9, though this time the line beside me looked very different from the one I remembered from that first terrifying morning. The Academy's revised curriculum had been implemented faster than anyone expected, driven by a growing recognition among the senior staff that our old training standards, however carefully built over generations, could no longer be treated as a reliable measure of galactic survivability, now that humans had entered the wider fleet in meaningful numbers. The new Class 9 briefing packet, I noticed as I reviewed it one final time before the doors opened, included an entirely new section, one that had not existed in any previous version of the curriculum. It was titled, with a simplicity that still struck me as faintly absurd, given everything that had led to its creation, Supplementary Comfort Provisions for Extended Field Exercises. Buried within its careful formal language was a modest but clearly deliberate addition to the standard survival kit. A small allotment of shelf-stable confectionery items, explicitly described as optional morale support rather than emergency nutrition. Corin, standing beside me in the new line, noticed me reading the section and made a small clicking sound of amusement with his mandibles. "They actually did it," he said. "I did not believe the rumor when I first heard it." "Neither did I admitted, though I had, in fact, heard the story confirmed by Lieutenant Ellery herself during a curriculum briefing the previous week. Somewhere in the long chain of formal reviews, physiological studies, and strategic reassessments that followed our drill, a single offhand complaint about marshmallows had survived every layer of institutional revision and found its way, quietly and almost comically, into official Academy policy. Further down the line, I spotted Mara Voss, back for a voluntary advanced session, now that her standard coursework had been adjusted to reflect the Academy's new understanding of human capability. She looked exactly as calm and unbothered as she had that very first day, chatting easily with a group of younger cadets who had clearly heard the stories about her and seemed equal parts nervous and fascinated to be standing anywhere near her. The Academy, I had learned over the preceding months, had not simply raised its standards to try to challenge human cadets more effectively. That approach, research had ultimately concluded, was neither practical nor particularly useful. Instead, the curriculum had shifted towards something more thoughtful, a recognition that different species required fundamentally different frameworks for measuring genuine risk, and that forcing every cadet through an identical standard of difficulty made little sense when the underlying physiology varied so dramatically across the fleet's member worlds. For cadets like myself, The drills remained just as demanding as before, calibrated carefully to our own species' limits, rather than stretched artificially to accommodate a baseline that simply did not apply to us. For human cadets, a new set of advanced exercises had been developed, drawing directly from Mara's own accounts of her homeworld's natural hazards, designed not to determine whether they could survive, since that question had already been answered rather emphatically, but to refine their skills, sharpen their instincts, and prepare them for genuinely novel challenges they might encounter serving among species and environments no human had ever previously experienced. 10 minutes until deployment, the automated voice announced, and I noticed, with some satisfaction, that its tone had returned to its usual measured neutrality, no longer carrying the strain it had displayed during the historic failure count from 3 months earlier. I made my way through the line toward Mara, curious to hear how her advanced session had been structured, and found her checking over a small pack she had brought along, one the Academy staff had apparently approved as a personal addition to her standard equipment. "What is in the pack?" I asked. She grinned, opening the flap just enough to show me a small collection of the same soft, pale confectionery items, now listed in the official curriculum documentation. "Figured I'd bring my own, just in case the standard allotment isn't quite enough," she said. "Also brought some for anyone else who wants to try them. You've never had a proper roasted marshmallow, right?" "I have not," I admitted, genuinely curious despite myself. "You're missing out," she said, closing the pack with the satisfied air of someone whose long campaign for basic camping decency had, against all reasonable expectation, finally succeeded. The doors to Chamber 9 slid open, and this time, standing in that line, I did not feel the same crushing fear that had gripped me 3 months earlier. I understood the storm now, understood its patterns and its dangers, and understood, perhaps most importantly, that surviving it required not blind endurance, but genuine adaptation, the kind of careful, patient understanding that Mara had shown from her very first step into that chamber. I still cannot say I fully understand humans, even now, even after everything I witnessed and everything I later learned through the Academy's ongoing research into their species. I do not think anyone across the fleet fully understands them yet, not the strategists poring over physiological data in distant command centers. Not the researchers still struggling to model exactly how a species could evolve such broad, flexible resilience across conditions the rest of us consider individually catastrophic, and certainly not the countless cadets across a dozen different academies who now train alongside human classmates and quietly, privately wonder what other surprises that species might still be holding in reserve. What I do understand, standing once more at the threshold of a storm that had once seemed like the end of everything I believed about survival and limits, is this. The galaxy had spent centuries building careful, methodical frameworks to measure danger, to classify worlds, to determine what could and could not sustain sapient life. And then a single human girl, humming a quiet tune and thinking mostly about marshmallows, had walked calmly through the worst of it, not because she was trying to prove anything, not because she wanted to unsettle an entire fleet's worth of assumptions, but simply because, to her, it had never really seemed like the terrifying ordeal the rest of us understood it to be. Perhaps that, more than anything else, is the real story the galaxy will remember. Not a tale of conquest or aggression, not some dramatic clash of fleets or ideologies, but the quiet, unassuming discovery that the most unsettling thing about humanity was never what they might do to the rest of us. It was simply how little they seemed to notice, or care, about the very dangers that had shaped every other civilization's understanding of what it meant to survive. The doors closed behind us as we stepped forward into the cold, and somewhere beside me, Mara Voss began humming that same familiar tune, entirely at ease, already thinking, I suspected, about nothing more dramatic than whether the fire she planned to build would hold steady long enough to properly roast a marshmallow,